There are moments when the universe doesn't just close a door, it welds it shut, boards up the windows, and sets fire to the house while you're still inside. When every breath feels like an act of rebellion against a world that has already decided you're not worth the oxygen. When the people who were supposed to see your potential become the architects of your burial, whispering to each other that some seeds were never meant to break through the soil. This is the story of a man who was declared dead long before his heart stopped beating, erased from the narrative before he had the chance to write a single line, condemned to irrelevance by a system that measures worth in dollars and pedigree and the accident of your birth. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have fathomed in their comfortable certainty, is that some souls don't shatter when you crush them. They crystallize. They transform under pressure. And when they finally break free, they don't just survive. They redefine what survival means. He came into this world during a winter so brutal that the hospital lost power twice during his mother's labor. She would tell him later, years later, when he was old enough to understand the weight of metaphor, that he was born in darkness and cold, that the first sound he made wasn't a cry but a scream, as if even then he knew what kind of fight was waiting for him. His father was gone before the ink dried on the birth certificate, not dead but worse, alive and indifferent, a ghost who chose to haunt someone else's life. His mother was 19 years old, $200 to her name, living in a studio apartment where the roaches outnumbered the furniture and the walls were so thin you could hear your neighbor's desperation seeping through like toxic gas. She worked as a waitress at a diner where truckers left dollar tips and commented on her body like she was part of the menu, then cleaned office buildings from midnight to 6 in the morning, then came home to a crying infant and the kind of exhaustion that rewrites your DNA, that makes you old in ways that have nothing to do with years. He grew up watching her disappear. Not physically. She was always there, always present in body if not in spirit. But she faded in increments, like a photograph left too long in the sun. Her smile became something she wore like a uniform, something she put on and took off depending on who was watching. Her eyes, which in old pictures sparkled with a kind of defiant hope, became flat and distant, like windows in an abandoned building. She never complained, never cried in front of him, never let him see the moments when she sat on the bathroom floor at 3 in the morning, trying to calculate whether they could afford both electricity and food this month, knowing the answer was no. But he felt it. Children always feel it. The weight their parents carry becomes the air they breathe, invisible but suffocating, shaping them in ways they won't understand until it's too late to undo. School was supposed to be different. That's the lie they sell you when you're young and poor and desperate for something to believe in. They tell you that education is the great equalizer, that it doesn't matter where you come from if you're willing to work hard, that in the classroom everyone starts at the same line. But they don't tell you that some kids show up having already eaten breakfast while you show up with a stomach eating itself. They don't tell you that when your shoes have holes and your coat is 2 sizes too small and you smell like the apartment where mold is a permanent resident, the other kids notice. They don't tell you that teachers, even the well-meaning ones, look at you with a kind of preemptive disappointment, like they're already writing the ending to your story before you finish the first chapter. He was 7 years old the first time a teacher told him to lower his expectations. 7. She didn't say it cruelly. She said it kindly, with a smile that was supposed to soften the blow, while explaining that not everyone is cut out for advanced classes, that some children are better suited for vocational training, that it's important to be realistic about our limitations. She meant well. They always mean well. But what she actually said, in the language beneath the language, was that children like him don't get to dream big, that his zip code was his destiny, that the circumstances of his birth were a life sentence with no possibility of parole. But he didn't listen. Or rather, he listened and then chose defiance. He started reading everything he could get his hands on, library books that he checked out and renewed, until the librarian knew him by name. Magazines left behind in waiting rooms, newspapers he found in trash cans. He read about scientists and artists and entrepreneurs and revolutionaries, people who had started with nothing and built something that mattered. He read about failure and persistence and the messy, non-linear path between obscurity and impact. And somewhere in those words, in those stories of people who refused to accept the world's verdict, he found something dangerous: belief. Not the naive kind that thinks wanting something badly enough makes it happen, but the stubborn kind that says the world doesn't get the final say on who you become. He started staying late at the library, not because he had nowhere else to go, though that was part of it, but because it was the only place where his circumstances didn't define him, where a book didn't care if his clothes were second-hand or if he qualified for free lunch, where knowledge was freely available to anyone willing to reach for it. His mother noticed. Of course she noticed. Mothers always notice. She would see him hunched over textbooks at the kitchen table, practicing math problems by the light of a lamp that flickered because the wiring in the building was older than both of them combined, and something in her face would shift. Pride mixed with terror. Because she knew what he was doing. He was building an escape route. And she wanted that for him more than she wanted her next breath. But she also knew what the world did to boys like him who dared to want more. How it built them up just high enough to make the fall more devastating. How it dangled possibility like a carrot and then snatched it away, laughing at the audacity of hope. So she did the only thing she could. She worked harder, took on extra shifts, skipped meals so he could eat, patched his clothes and polished his second-hand shoes, and made sure that when he walked out the door every morning, he looked like someone who mattered, even if the world was determined to prove otherwise. Middle school was when the rejection started to crystallize into something systematic. He applied for a magnet school, one of those places that promised opportunity to students from disadvantaged backgrounds, that claimed to look beyond test scores and see potential. He spent weeks on the application, wrote essays about his dreams and his determination, got letters of recommendation from teachers who believed in him, submitted it with a kind of desperate optimism that hurt to witness. And then he waited. The rejection letter arrived on a Tuesday. He read it alone in the apartment while his mother was at work. The language was polite, professional, regretful. They had received many qualified applicants. The competition was fierce. They encouraged him to apply again next year. But what the letter actually said, in the white space between the lines, was that he wasn't special. That whatever he thought made him different, made him worthy, wasn't enough. That there were thousands of kids just like him, and the world only had room for a handful, and he wasn't one of them. He didn't cry. He sat very still, holding the letter, feeling something inside him begin to calcify. The first layer of armor. The beginning of the wall he would spend years building between himself and the world that kept rejecting him. But he didn't quit. That's the thing about certain kinds of pain. It can either destroy you or forge you, and which one happens depends on choices so small they're almost invisible. He stayed in regular public school, where the ceilings leaked, and the textbooks were a decade old, and teachers were stretched so thin they were practically transparent. He kept studying, kept reading, kept believing, or at least pretending to believe, that effort mattered. He joined every free program he could find: after-school tutoring, weekend workshops, summer camps for at-risk youth. He hated that term. At risk, like he was a disease, like his poverty was contagious, like just by existing in his circumstances, he was a problem that needed to be managed rather than a person who deserved opportunity. But he swallowed his pride and went anyway, because pride is a luxury and he couldn't afford luxuries. He learned to code at a community center where the computers were ancient and the internet connection dropped every 5 minutes. He learned to write at a program funded by a non-profit where well-meaning volunteers praised him for being articulate, as if the ability to form coherent sentences was surprising in someone who looked like him, came from where he came from. High school brought a new kind of torture, the college application process. By then he had transcripts that told a story of relentless effort. Straight A's despite everything, AP classes that his school barely offered, extracurriculars cobbled together from whatever free resources existed in a neighborhood where resources were scarce as rain in a desert. He was exactly the kind of student admissions officers claimed they wanted. The bootstrap puller, the overcomer of obstacles, the inspirational story that looked good in a brochure. He applied to 43 colleges. Not just elite schools, though he shot his shot at those too, but state schools and private schools and small liberal arts colleges that advertised their commitment to socioeconomic diversity. He wrote essays that laid his life bare, that turned his pain into prose, that explained the context of his achievement in language that was neither self-pitying nor self-aggrandizing. He asked for application fee waivers because $60 fees might as well have been $600. He submitted everything early, double-checked every requirement, did everything right. The rejection letters started arriving in March. One by one, they filled the mailbox like tombstones. He didn't open them in front of his mother anymore. Couldn't bear to watch her face as the hope drained out of it, replaced by something worse than disappointment. Helplessness. She had done everything she could, sacrificed everything she had, and it still wasn't enough. He wasn't enough. By April, he had 41 rejections and 2 acceptances, both from schools he couldn't afford even with the financial aid they offered. The gap between what they expected his family to contribute and what his family actually had was so vast it was almost funny. Almost. He sat with the acceptance letters, doing math that didn't add up, trying to figure out how he could make it work. Maybe he could take out massive loans. Maybe he could work full-time and go to school part-time. Maybe he could defer for a year, save up, try again. Maybe. The word became a mantra and a curse, a doorway that led nowhere. He didn't go to college that fall. Instead, he got a job at a warehouse, one of those massive fulfillment centers where you're less a person than a productivity metric, where computers track your every movement and penalize you for being human, for needing to rest or eat or use the bathroom. He loaded trucks for 10 hours a day, came home with his body screaming and his mind numb, ate whatever cheap food he could microwave, and then sat in front of his laptop trying to figure out what the hell he was supposed to do with a life that had already peaked at 18. His mother tried to encourage him, told him this was temporary, that he could try again next year, that the universe had a plan even when we couldn't see it. But her voice had a hollow quality now, like she was reading lines from a script she no longer believed. And late at night when she thought he was asleep, he could hear her crying in the next room, the sound muffled by a pillow but still audible through walls that were never meant to contain that much sorrow. The warehouse became his world. Wake at 5, work until 3, home by 4, numb by 6, asleep by 9. Repeat. The days bled into each other, indistinguishable and meaningless, a gray expanse of time that felt less like living than like waiting to die. The people he worked with were ghosts like him, individuals reduced to functions, dreams deferred so long they'd fossilized into resignation. They didn't talk much. What was there to say? They all knew they were interchangeable parts in a machine that would replace them the second it became profitable to do so. He made friends with a guy named Marcus, who had been there for 7 years, who had started at 18 just like him with plans to save up for college, and who was now 25 and still loading trucks, still telling himself it was temporary, still dying in slow motion. Marcus had kind eyes and a laugh that sounded like broken glass, and he told him one day during a 15-minute break, "Don't be like me, man. Don't let this place make you forget you were supposed to be somebody." But how do you remember you were supposed to be somebody when every mirror shows you a ghost? When every morning you wake up, and the first thing you feel is a soul-deep exhaustion that has nothing to do with the body. When the dreams you used to have feel like they belong to a different person, someone naive enough to believe that wanting something was enough. He started to forget what hope felt like. Not intellectually. He could still define the word, but viscerally. It stopped being something he felt and became something he remembered feeling, like a language he used to speak, but could no longer form the words for. He stopped reading, stopped learning, stopped doing anything that reminded him of the future he was supposed to have, because it hurt too much. Because every book was a reminder of doors that had closed. Every story of someone who made it was a story about someone who wasn't him. Then something happened that cracked the numbness. His mother collapsed at work, just dropped in the middle of her shift at the diner, her body finally saying what her mouth never would. "I can't do this anymore." He got the call from a co-worker and raced to the hospital, his heart hammering so hard he thought it would break through his ribs. And when he finally saw her, small and fragile in a hospital bed, hooked up to machines that beeped like digital heartbeats, something in him shattered. The doctor said it was exhaustion and dehydration and stress, said she needed rest, as if rest was something she could afford, as if she had a choice, as if the world she lived in allowed for recovery. She looked at him with those tired, tired eyes and tried to smile and said she was fine. She'd be back at work in a few days. Don't worry about her. And he wanted to scream, wanted to tear the room apart, wanted to rage at a universe so cruel it would break the best person he knew, and then tell her to get back to work. He stayed with her overnight, sitting in a plastic chair that made his back ache, listening to her breathe, and somewhere in those quiet hours something shifted. He realized that this was what giving up looked like. Not a dramatic surrender, not a moment of defeat, but a slow erosion of the self, until there's nothing left but motion. His mother had given him everything, her youth, her health, her dreams, and he had taken it and let himself become exactly what the world expected. A statistic, a cautionary tale, a person who tried and failed and stopped trying. And in that moment, watching her sleep in a hospital bed she couldn't afford, he made a decision that was less about hope and more about spite. He was going to fight back. Not because he believed he would win, but because surrendering meant their victory was complete. And he refused to give them that satisfaction. He started with something small, almost embarrassingly small. He began writing again. Not for anyone else. He didn't have the audacity to think anyone would care, but for himself. To organize the chaos in his head. To make sense of a life that felt senseless. He wrote about the warehouse and the rejection letters and his mother and the particular kind of rage that comes from watching someone you love destroy themselves for a system that doesn't care if they live or die. He wrote in notebooks during his lunch breaks, in the margins of his thoughts when sleep wouldn't come. It wasn't good. It wasn't poetry or prose or anything that mattered. But it was honest. And honesty, he was learning, was the only currency he had left. One night, on a whim that felt more like self-destruction than inspiration, he started a blog. Nothing fancy. Free platform, generic template, no expectations. He posted some of what he'd been writing, raw, unedited thoughts about class and struggle and the feeling of being invisible in a world that only sees you when it wants to blame you for your own circumstances. He titled it Letters from Nowhere, because that's what it felt like. Messages sent from a place that didn't exist on any map that mattered. He shared the link in a few online forums, places where people gathered to talk about poverty and inequality, and the specific kind of violence that comes with being poor in a rich country. And then he forgot about it. Because what difference could it possibly make? The first comment came 3 days later. A paragraph from someone who said they had grown up the same way, felt the same things, and had never seen it articulated so clearly. They said his words made them feel less alone. It was such a small thing. One comment from one stranger on the internet. But it did something to him. Reminded him that his experience wasn't just his. That the pain he carried was shared by millions of people who thought they were the only ones. That maybe his story had value not in spite of its ordinariness, but because of it. So he kept writing, kept posting. No strategy, no plan, no expectation beyond the act itself. Just the discipline of showing up, of turning his invisible life into visible words. Slowly, impossibly, people started reading. 10 people became 50. 50 became 200. Then 500. They left comments sharing their own stories, their own struggles, thanking him for putting into words what they couldn't express themselves. Some of them were still fighting. Some had given up. Some were in the middle, suspended in that terrible liminal space between hope and despair, looking for something, anything, to hold on to. And his words became that thing, not because they were particularly brilliant or insightful, but because they were true. Because he wrote with the kind of naked honesty that only comes from having nothing left to lose. Because in a world of highlight reels and curated perfection, he offered something rare, the unfiltered reality of struggle without redemption, of pain without purpose, of fighting not because you believe you'll win but because giving up means they've won. He started receiving emails. Long, detailed messages from people across the country, across the world, telling him how much his writing meant to them. Single mothers working 3 jobs, college dropouts crushed by debt, immigrants trying to build lives in a language that wasn't theirs, veterans dealing with PTSD and a system that had used them up and thrown them away, foster kids aging out with nowhere to go, the invisible army of people who kept the world running while the world pretended they didn't exist. They saw themselves in his words, and he saw them in his struggles. The blog stopped being about him. It became about all of them. A collective testimony. A record of lives that history wouldn't remember but that mattered nonetheless. His writing caught the attention of a journalist at a major publication who was working on a piece about economic inequality. She reached out, asked if she could interview him, feature his story alongside others. He said yes, not because he wanted attention but because maybe it would reach someone who needed to hear it. The article came out 6 weeks later. His real name, his face, his story laid bare for the world to see. He braced himself for mockery or indifference or the particular kind of performative sympathy that people offer before scrolling past. But what happened instead shocked him. The article went viral. Not because it was scandalous or sensational, but because it told a truth that millions of people recognized but rarely saw acknowledged. That the system was broken. That hard work often led nowhere. That the American dream had become a cruel joke for anyone born on the wrong side of the wealth gap. His blog traffic exploded. Thousands of new readers every day. Media outlets reached out for interviews. Organizations working on poverty and inequality asked him to speak at events, to share his story, to give voice to experiences that policymakers and academics studied but didn't understand. And suddenly, terrifyingly, he had a platform. Not because he'd planned for it or worked toward it in any strategic way, but because he'd done the one thing that seemed most pointless. He'd told the truth. He'd refused to sanitize his struggle or wrap it in a neat narrative of triumph. He'd shown the reality of poverty in all its mundane, grinding brutality. And people responded not with pity, but with recognition. With the relief that comes from finally being seen. But visibility brings scrutiny. The comment sections filled not just with support, but with attacks. People who insisted he was exaggerating, that anyone could succeed if they just tried hard enough, that his failure was evidence of some personal deficiency rather than systemic injustice. People who had never been poor explaining poverty to him. People who had never faced rejection explaining that he must not have really wanted it. The usual chorus of those who mistake their privilege for wisdom, their luck for merit. It stung. Every dismissive comment, every accusation that he was making excuses or playing the victim felt like a knife between the ribs. But it also clarified something. The people who needed to hear his message would never be the ones already comfortable. His words weren't for them. They were for the others. The ones still loading trucks and cleaning toilets and working themselves to death, while being told their poverty was a personal failing. He continued working at the warehouse even as his writing gained traction, partly because he needed the money. Poverty doesn't care about your social media following, but also because leaving felt like betrayal. Like he was abandoning the people still trapped there, using them as a stepping stone to something better. Marcus noticed the change, the interviews, the attention. One day he pulled him aside and said, with a mix of pride and sadness, "You're getting out. Good. Somebody should." And the way he said it, like it was a foregone conclusion that most of them wouldn't, that only the exceptional few escaped while the rest stayed buried, made him want to burn the whole system down. Opportunities started coming. A literary agent reached out about turning his blog into a book. Organizations offered paid speaking gigs. Nonprofits wanted him to join advisory boards. And he said yes to some of it, no to most of it, trying to navigate this strange new world where his pain had become marketable, where the story of his struggle was suddenly worth money to people who would never actually fix the conditions that created it. He was hyper-aware of the line between testimony and exploitation, between using his platform to amplify others and becoming another poverty-porn narrative that allowed comfortable people to feel briefly moved before going back to their lives unchanged. He quit the warehouse when his writing income finally exceeded what he made loading trucks. It felt surreal walking out for the last time, knowing he didn't have to come back, knowing that the next morning he could wake up and choose how to spend his time. Marcus threw him a small goodbye party during their lunch break, cheap grocery store cake and warm soda and handshakes from men who looked at him like he'd won the lottery, like he'd somehow beaten odds that were designed to be unbeatable. He gave Marcus his personal number, made him promise to call if he ever needed anything. 2 months later, Marcus did call, to say he'd been fired for missing too many days after his daughter got sick, to ask if he knew anyone hiring, to apologize for bothering him. That call kept him up for 3 nights straight, reminded him that his escape was an exception, not evidence that the system worked, and that for every one person who made it out, 1,000 others were still drowning. His mother's health improved slowly once she was finally able to rest. He convinced her to quit one of her jobs, then another, using the money from his writing to cover the gap. Watching her slowly come back to herself, seeing the color return to her face, hearing her laugh without it sounding like it hurt, was the first time success felt like more than just abstract validation. She cried when he told her she didn't have to work anymore, that he could take care of her now the way she'd taken care of him, said she didn't want to be a burden. And he held her hands, those hands that had scrubbed floors and served food and patched his clothes, and held him through every nightmare, and told her she could never be a burden, that everything he had was because she'd given him everything she had, that this wasn't charity but the repayment of an impossible debt. The book came out almost 2 years after that first blog post. He'd worked with an editor who understood what he was trying to do, not write a rags-to-riches inspiration porn story, but an honest, unflinching look at what poverty actually does to people, how it warps your sense of self and possibility, how it makes you feel like you're failing at something rigged from the start. The book told his story, but also told the stories of dozens of others, people he'd met at the warehouse, classmates who'd dropped out, neighbors who died young from preventable causes because they couldn't afford health care. He donated a portion of the proceeds to mutual aid funds and bail funds and organizations doing actual work to help people, not just study them. The book became a bestseller. Not because it offered easy answers or comforting narratives, but because it named something that too many people recognized and too few had the language to describe. Suddenly, he was being invited to speak at universities, not community colleges or state schools, but the Ivy League institutions that had rejected him years earlier. The irony wasn't lost on him. Standing in front of students who'd been given every advantage, whose struggles consisted of choosing between unpaid internships at prestigious companies, trying to explain a world they could barely imagine. Some of them listened, really listened, asked thoughtful questions about privilege and access and what they could do. Others seemed to view him as an interesting anthropological specimen, proof that the system sometimes allowed a particularly resilient poor person through. Therefore, the system was fine. He learned to read a room, to know when his words were landing and when he was just performing his trauma for an audience that would forget him before they left the building. He started a podcast with Marcus, who had skills and insights and stories that deserved a bigger platform. They called it From the Bottom, and focused on conversations with people still fighting. Not survivors who'd made it out, but people in the thick of it, still struggling, still trying to navigate systems designed to break them. It was deliberately unglamorous. No studio equipment, no professional production, just two guys with microphones talking to people whose voices rarely got heard. And it resonated. Because there's a hunger out there for stories that don't have neat endings, for honest accounts of survival that acknowledge the ongoing nature of struggle, for proof that you don't have to be extraordinary to matter. A producer from a major streaming platform reached out about doing a documentary series, not about him specifically, but about the realities of poverty in America, using his story as a framework to explore systemic issues. He agreed on one condition: that the people featured would be compensated fairly, that their participation wouldn't just be extractive, that the series would commit resources to the communities it was documenting. They negotiated for months. The entertainment industry wanted a certain kind of story, redemptive, individual, focused on personal triumph. He pushed for something more honest and structural, something that would make viewers uncomfortable rather than inspired. They found a middle ground that satisfied neither of them completely, but felt less like a betrayal than the alternative. The documentary series premiered to critical acclaim and controversy. Critics praised its unflinching look at inequality. Politicians complained it was biased and depressing. Economists debated its accuracy. And millions of people watched it and saw themselves, saw their families, saw the truth that had been hiding in plain sight beneath layers of mythology about meritocracy and bootstraps. It sparked conversations, not just online discourse that would fade in a week, but real policy discussions, legislative proposals, grassroots movements. He didn't take credit for any of it. The work had always been there, done by organizers and activists and communities who'd been fighting for decades. He was just a megaphone, just someone who happened to have access to platforms that usually excluded voices like his. But here's what they don't tell you about becoming visible when you come from invisibility. You become a symbol, whether you want to or not. Some people saw him as proof that the system worked, that anyone could make it with enough determination. Others saw him as a sellout, someone who'd escaped and now made money talking about struggles he no longer faced. Both readings felt reductive. The truth was messier. He still had nightmares about being back in the warehouse, about rejection letters, about his mother collapsing. He still felt like an imposter in rooms full of successful people, like someone playing a role rather than inhabiting a life. Success didn't erase the scars. It just gave him different problems. He used his platform strategically, started a fund to pay off medical debt for families in his old neighborhood, partnered with organizations providing free tutoring and college prep for kids who couldn't afford it, lobbied for policy changes around housing and health care and education funding, wrote op-eds that made people uncomfortable, showed up at protests and picket lines, tried to be useful rather than just inspirational, because inspiration without action is just aesthetic. It's a way for people to feel good without changing anything. And the thing he'd learned, the thing that had been beaten into him over years of struggle, was that the system didn't need to be inspired. It needed to be transformed. 5 years after that first blog post, he stood on a stage at a conference about economic inequality, looking out at an audience full of policymakers and philanthropists and nonprofit leaders, and he told them a truth they didn't want to hear: that he was the exception that proved the rule, that his success didn't validate the system but indicted it, that in a just world his story would be boring because everyone would have the opportunities he'd had to fight for. He told them that treating poverty as a personal failing rather than a policy choice was violence, that every person working full-time and still unable to afford housing or health care or food was evidence of a society that had failed, not individuals who hadn't tried hard enough. He told them that he was tired of being paraded around as proof of possibility, while millions of people identical to him in every way except luck remained trapped in the circumstances he'd escaped. Some people in that audience got angry, accused him of biting the hand that fed him, of being ungrateful for the opportunities he'd been given. But others, the ones who mattered, listened. And a few of them, people with actual power and resources, started having different conversations, started questioning assumptions, started funding different kinds of work. It wasn't revolution. It was barely reform. But it was something. A crack in the facade. A small admission that maybe the way things were wasn't the way things had to be. His mother got to see it all, got to watch him speak at conferences and see his book on bestseller lists and meet people who told her that her son had changed their lives. She never said, "I told you so," though she would have been justified. She just smiled that smile, the one that had carried him through every dark moment, and said she was proud of him. Not because he was successful, but because he'd stayed kind, because he'd used his platform to lift others rather than just himself, because he'd become someone who tried to break the ladder he'd climbed rather than pull it up behind him. That meant more to him than any award or accolade ever could. Marcus eventually got a better job, one with benefits and dignity and a future. They still recorded the podcast together every week, still told stories about people who deserved to be remembered. The warehouse closed down eventually, automated away in the name of efficiency and profit margins. Some of the people he'd worked with found other jobs. Some didn't. Some fell through the cracks entirely, disappeared into the invisible America that everyone knows exists but no one wants to see. He tried to stay connected, to help where he could, but there were limits to what one person could do. The problems were structural. The solutions required more than individual charity or inspiring stories. They required a fundamental reimagining of who mattered and why. Years passed. His life stabilized in ways he still found disorienting. He bought a house, not a mansion, but a real house with a yard and a porch and enough space to breathe. Set up an office where he could write without the anxiety of eviction notices or disconnection warnings. Built a life that didn't require constant crisis management. And sometimes, late at night when the house was quiet and he couldn't sleep, he would think about all the versions of himself that didn't make it, the ones who gave up, the ones who took wrong turns, the ones who were identical to him in every way except the specific sequence of chances and choices that led here instead of there. He didn't believe he was better than them. He believed he was luckier, and that luck felt less like blessing and more like responsibility. He kept writing. Not because he had to anymore, but because the work wasn't finished. Because there were still stories that needed telling, truths that needed speaking, people who needed to know they weren't alone in their struggles. He wrote about the complexity of escape, about survivor's guilt and imposter syndrome, and the particular kind of grief that comes from leaving people behind. He wrote about his mother and Marcus, and all the people whose names no one would remember but whose lives mattered just as much as anyone else's. He wrote because silence had almost killed him, and because words, honest, unflinching words, had saved him. And if they could save him, maybe they could save someone else. The documentary won awards. The book became required reading in some college courses about inequality. He got invited to fancy dinners and exclusive events, and all the trappings of success in a society that measures worth in visibility and income. And every single time, he felt like a translator between two worlds that couldn't speak the same language: the world of deprivation and the world of abundance. The world where missing a paycheck meant homelessness, and the world where that reality was an abstract policy discussion. He tried to build bridges, tried to make the comfortable, uncomfortable, and the struggling feel seen. It was exhausting work. But what was the alternative? Silence? Complicity? Using his escape to validate a system that destroyed people like him every single day? He thought about the teacher who'd told him to lower his expectations, about the colleges that had rejected him, about every person who had looked at him and seen limits rather than potential. And he realized something that felt like the closest thing to peace he'd ever experienced. They hadn't been wrong about the odds. They had been wrong about him, and maybe that was enough. Not to prove them wrong. Their opinions of him had never mattered as much as his opinion of himself, but to prove that the story doesn't end where they say it does. That rejection is information, not destiny. That the people who count you out are not the ones who get to write your ending. They tried to end him. Every closed door, every rejection letter, every systemic barrier designed to keep people like him in their place, every voice that whispered he wasn't good enough, smart enough, worthy enough, they all tried to end him. And for a long time, he almost let them. Almost accepted that this was just how the world worked, that some people were born to struggle and others were born to succeed, and nothing you did could change which side of that line you fell on. But somewhere in the silence, in the space between giving up and getting up one more time, he found something that changed everything. Not hope, exactly. Hope felt too fragile, too dependent on circumstances beyond his control. But something more fundamental: defiance. The refusal to let their story about him become the truth. The stubborn, irrational, beautiful decision to keep moving even when movement seemed pointless. Because here's what he learned in those years of struggle. In the warehouse and the rejection letters and the nights when giving up felt like the only logical choice. You don't need to believe you'll win to keep fighting. You don't need hope to take the next step. You just need to refuse to accept that this grinding poverty, this systematic exclusion, this life of invisible suffering, is all you deserve. And that refusal, that tiny act of rebellion repeated day after day, becomes something bigger. It becomes a crack in the foundation. It becomes proof that the world's verdict isn't final. It becomes the beginning of everything. He started speaking at high schools in neighborhoods like the one he grew up in. Not the fancy auditoriums with perfect acoustics and attentive students, but the underfunded schools with metal detectors and teachers who were barely holding on, where kids showed up already exhausted from adult responsibilities, from taking care of siblings or working night shifts or navigating violence that left scars you couldn't see. He didn't give them motivational speeches about dreaming big or working hard. He told them the truth, that the system was rigged, that hard work often led nowhere, that they would face obstacles that had nothing to do with their merit and everything to do with circumstances they didn't choose. And then he told them the other truth, that they still had power. Not the power to magically overcome every barrier, but the power to refuse to disappear. The power to tell their stories. The power to support each other. The power to fight back in whatever ways were available to them. After one of these talks, a girl approached him. She was maybe 16, with eyes that had seen too much and a question that cut straight through every defense he'd built. "Did you ever think about killing yourself?" She asked it matter-of-factly, like she was asking about the weather. And he could have lied. could have given her some sanitized version of his story that skipped over the darkest parts. But she deserved better than that. So he told her yes. That there were nights when existing felt like too much work, when the weight of disappointment and rejection and watching his mother destroy herself for nothing made him think that maybe everyone would be better off if he just stopped. That he'd stood on subway platforms and thought about how easy it would be to take one step forward. That he'd written goodbye letters he never sent. That suicidal ideation wasn't some distant concept but a constant companion during the worst years. A seductive whisper promising relief from pain that felt eternal. "What stopped you?" she asked, and her voice was so small, so desperately searching for an answer that might apply to her own life. And he told her the truth about that too. It wasn't some grand revelation or sudden surge of hope. It was small things. His mother's face. The thought of adding to her suffering instead of ending his own. Curiosity about what might happen if he just lasted one more day. The mathematical possibility, however slim, that things could be different tomorrow than they were today. And underneath all of it, buried so deep he barely recognized it, anger. Rage at a world that had treated him like garbage and now wanted him to take himself out like trash. The realization that dying would be letting them win would be the final proof that he never mattered in the first place. So he stayed alive not because he wanted to, but because he refused to give them that satisfaction. And eventually, slowly, staying alive stopped being an act of defiance and became just living. Not happy living, not the life he'd imagined, but living nonetheless. And that was enough. It had to be enough. The girl started crying. Not the dramatic sobbing of movies, but the quiet, almost silent tears of someone who'd forgotten how to cry out loud, who'd learned to suffer quietly so as not to burden anyone else. He gave her his email, told her to reach out if she needed to talk, told her that whatever she was feeling was valid, and that surviving it made her stronger than most people would ever have to be. She thanked him and disappeared back into the crowd of students, and he never heard from her again. He thinks about her sometimes, hopes she made it, hopes his honesty helped rather than hurt, hopes that in a world determined to make certain kids disappear, she found a way to stay visible. The foundation he started began as a small, scrappy operation focused on direct aid. No complicated application processes or means testing or degrading requirements. Just, do you need help? Here's help. They paid off medical debt, covered rent for families facing eviction, provided groceries to people who had to choose between eating and other necessities, funded emergency expenses that would have pushed people over the edge. It wasn't systematic change. It wasn't solving root causes. But it was immediate relief for people drowning. And sometimes that's what matters. Sometimes keeping someone's head above water for another day is the difference between survival and catastrophe. He knew because he'd been there. Had been one emergency away from complete collapse for most of his life. They also started a mentorship program, pairing kids from low-income backgrounds with adults who'd navigated similar circumstances. Not the traditional model where successful professionals deign to spend an hour a month with disadvantaged youth, but real relationships built on mutual respect and shared understanding. Mentors who'd been poor themselves, who understood the specific challenges and indignities and catch-22s of poverty in ways that well-meaning volunteers never could. The program focused on practical support, help with college applications, financial aid navigation, finding scholarships, but also emotional support. Someone to talk to when the weight felt unbearable. Someone who understood that depression and anxiety aren't character flaws, but rational responses to impossible circumstances. Someone who could say, "I've been there," and have it mean something. Years into this work, he received a letter that broke him open in ways he wasn't prepared for. It was from a woman in her 40s who'd read his book while sitting in her car, having just been evicted from her apartment. She was living out of that car with her 2 kids, working 2 jobs that still didn't add up to enough, feeling like she'd failed at everything that mattered. She wrote that his book was the first thing that made her feel like maybe her poverty wasn't her fault, that maybe she hadn't failed, but had been failed, that reading about his struggle while living her own gave her something she'd lost, the ability to be angry instead of just ashamed. And that anger, she wrote, saved her life, because shame makes you want to disappear. But anger makes you want to fight. She wanted him to know that she'd used that anger productively, had connected with tenant organizations, learned about her rights, started organizing other families facing eviction, that she was still struggling but no longer felt alone in it, that she was teaching her kids to fight back instead of accepting suffering as their natural state. He kept that letter in his desk drawer and read it whenever the work felt futile, whenever he wondered if any of this mattered, whenever the scale of suffering felt so vast that his small efforts seemed like drops in an ocean of need. Because that letter reminded him of something crucial. You don't measure impact by how many people you reach. You measure it by what happens to the people you do reach. And if his story, his honesty about struggle without redemption, helped one woman survive and resist, and teach her children to do the same, that was everything. That was the point. Not to inspire millions, but to connect with the people who needed to know they weren't alone, weren't crazy, weren't failing at something that was actually designed to destroy them. The media requests never stopped coming, but he became more selective about which ones he accepted. He stopped doing interviews that wanted him to perform gratitude or attribute his success to personal qualities rather than a combination of effort and circumstances beyond his control. He stopped participating in panels about overcoming poverty that didn't include actual poor people, just formerly poor people who now made comfortable livings talking about poverty. He became a pain in the ass, frankly, called out moderators who asked condescending questions, pushed back against narratives that individualized systemic problems, used every platform to redirect attention to people still fighting, organizations doing the work, policies that could actually change outcomes rather than just individual stories of escape. This didn't make him popular in certain circles. He lost speaking opportunities because he wasn't inspirational enough, because he made audiences uncomfortable rather than allowing them to feel good about caring. He was fine with that. The audiences that needed to feel good about themselves without changing anything weren't the audiences he wanted to reach anyway. He was after something different, a fundamental shift in how people understood poverty, not as a moral failing or a temporary setback that the deserving could overcome, but as a structural violence that killed people daily while society pretended it was somehow their fault for not trying hard enough. His writing evolved too. The early stuff had been raw and personal, focused on his own experience. But as his understanding deepened, as he listened to countless others tell their stories, his work became more analytical without losing its emotional core. He wrote about how poverty wasn't just lack of money but lack of time, of health, of dignity, of choices, of the mental bandwidth to imagine alternatives. He wrote about the poverty trap, how being poor was expensive, how you paid more for everything from housing to banking to groceries, how you couldn't afford to buy in bulk or invest in quality or plan for the future because you were too busy trying to survive the present. He wrote about the psychological impact of constant scarcity, how it rewired your brain, made you make decisions that looked irrational from the outside, but were perfectly rational given the circumstances. He wrote about the ways poverty was criminalized, how being poor could get you arrested, how fines and fees could spiral into warrants and jail time, how the legal system extracted resources from people who had nothing left to give. And he wrote about resistance, about the mutual aid networks that functioned in every poor community, the ways people who had nothing shared with each other, because they understood that survival was collective, or it was nothing. About the tenant unions and worker centers and community organizations fighting for dignity in a system designed to deny it. about the small acts of rebellion that happened every day. People refusing to be ashamed, refusing to be silent, refusing to accept that their suffering was natural or inevitable or deserved. He documented a resistance that most people never saw because it wasn't spectacular or photogenic, because it was people just trying to live with some measure of humanity in conditions designed to dehumanize them. His mother's health stabilized, then improved, then flourished in ways neither of them had thought possible. With actual rest, with real nutrition, with access to health care and time to heal, she transformed. The exhaustion that had defined her for decades lifted like fog burning off in sunlight. She started laughing more, a sound he'd almost forgotten. Started pursuing hobbies she'd abandoned years ago when survival took precedence over living. Took classes, made friends, became a person beyond just his mother, beyond just a body grinding itself down in service of everyone else's needs. And watching her blossom, seeing what she could be when she wasn't being slowly killed by poverty, made him angrier than anything else ever had, because it meant that all those years of suffering had been unnecessary, that she could have had this life all along if the world had been structured differently, that her sacrifice, while real and meaningful, had been required by a system that could have chosen otherwise. She started volunteering at the foundation, working with other mothers who were where she'd been, exhausted, scared, trying to hold everything together with willpower and prayer. She didn't give them advice. She just listened, just sat with them in their fear and frustration, and made sure they knew they weren't alone. Sometimes that's all you can offer. Sometimes that's everything. The mothers who came through the foundation's doors looked at her and saw what survival could look like on the other side. Saw that it was possible to emerge from the grinding machine not completely destroyed. Saw someone who understood their exhaustion not as concept but as lived experience. She became one of their most valuable assets, not because of any special training or expertise, but because she'd been there, because she could say, "I know," and have it mean something true. Marcus's podcast became something of a phenomenon in certain circles. Not mainstream popular, but cult followed by people who needed to hear honest conversations about struggle without the sanitizing filter of media narratives. They interviewed people who were still in it, working multiple jobs, navigating homelessness, dealing with addiction and mental health crises and family trauma, and all the messy realities that inspirational stories usually edited out. They talked about failure, about relapses, about the days when getting out of bed felt like climbing a mountain, about the specific kind of exhaustion that comes from fighting the same battles day after day with no end in sight. And people listened because it was real. Because it didn't promise that everything would be okay if you just tried hard enough. Because it acknowledged that sometimes you do everything right and still lose, and that's not your fault, and you're not alone in it. The documentary series led to others. Production companies started seeking out authentic voices, stories that didn't fit the traditional narrative arc of struggle overcome triumph. They documented people mid-journey, people for whom success was simply still being alive, still trying, still refusing to disappear. They showed the structural forces at work, how policy decisions made in comfortable offices translated to human suffering on the ground, how the system wasn't broken but working exactly as designed, concentrating wealth and power while grinding up everyone else. The films made people uncomfortable. Good. Comfort was the enemy of change. Comfort was what allowed people to look away, to believe that suffering happening somewhere else to someone else was somehow acceptable or inevitable. He kept growing, kept learning, kept interrogating his own assumptions and privileges, even as someone who'd come from nothing. Because privilege isn't just about where you start, it's also about where you end up, what doors open for you, what options become available. And he had options now that most people in his old neighborhood would never have. He could choose to work or not, could travel, could take risks. could speak truth without fear of losing everything because he'd already secured his basics. That was privilege. Understanding it, naming it, not pretending that his current circumstances were earned through merit alone, rather than being the intersection of effort and opportunity and timing and luck. That was crucial. That was the difference between being someone who escaped and used it to validate the system versus someone who escaped and used it to indict the system. He started teaching, adjunct at first at a community college where students looked like younger versions of himself, tired, working, trying to build something better while the world threw obstacles in their path. He taught writing, but really he taught that their stories mattered, that their experiences were valid material, that they didn't need to sound like people from different circumstances to be taken seriously. He taught that the most powerful writing came from specificity and honesty, from refusing to sand down the rough edges of experience to make it more palatable. His classes were full because students recognized something real in him, someone who'd sat where they were sitting and understood what it took to just show up. He became the professor he'd needed when he was their age, someone who saw them, believed in them, didn't let them make excuses, but also didn't pretend the obstacles they faced were imaginary. Some of his students went on to do remarkable things. Others disappeared, pulled under by circumstances beyond their control, or choices they made in moments of desperation or simply bad luck. He tried not to take either outcome personally, but of course he did. Each success felt like vindication. Each disappearance felt like failure. He had to remind himself constantly that he wasn't responsible for fixing people or saving them, that his job was just to show up and be honest, and create space for them to find their own paths. But God, it was hard. Watching talented, brilliant, deserving students get crushed by systems that didn't care about talent or brilliance or desert. Watching them make it to the finish line only to find that the reward wasn't enough to actually change their circumstances in any meaningful way. Higher education, he learned, was both path to opportunity and another mechanism of false promise, telling poor kids that a degree would save them while saddling them with debt that functionally recreated the poverty they were trying to escape. The 10th anniversary of that first blog post arrived almost without him noticing. A decade since he'd started writing into the void, since he'd decided that disappearing quietly wasn't an option, since he'd taken the first step on a path he couldn't see the end of. He marked it with a post that went back to basics, just honest reflection on what had changed and what hadn't. He'd gained platform and resources and opportunities, but people were still sleeping in cars and choosing between medicine and food and working themselves to death for wages that didn't cover rent. Kids were still growing up in neighborhoods he'd left behind, facing the same barriers, hearing the same lies about bootstraps and merit. The fundamental injustice that had shaped his life was still shaping millions of lives. His escape hadn't fixed anything except his own circumstances, and that was the thing he needed people to understand. Individual success stories were beautiful and important and worth celebrating, but they weren't proof of system functionality. They were proof of human resilience despite system dysfunction. The post went viral again, starting new conversations, attracting new criticism. Some accused him of downplaying his achievements, of not being grateful enough for how far he'd come. Others accused him of exploitation, of profiting from poverty while claiming to critique it. He understood both criticisms even if he disagreed with them. It was complicated. Everything was complicated. But what was the alternative? Stop telling the truth because it was uncomfortable? Stop pointing out systemic problems because he'd personally found a way around them? Pretend that his success meant the system worked, rather than that he'd gotten lucky? No. The discomfort was the point. The complication was the truth. And if he couldn't be honest about it, if he couldn't use his platform to tell the full story rather than just the parts that made people feel good, then what was any of it for? He turned 40 in a house that would have been unimaginable to his teenage self. Surrounded by people he loved, his mother, Marcus, former students, colleagues, friends he'd made in this strange second life. There was cake and laughter, and the particular warmth that comes from being around people who actually know you, not just the public version but the messy, private version that still has nightmares and doubts and bad days. His mother gave a toast that made everyone cry, talking about the little boy who'd refused to give up, even when giving up would have been reasonable, who'd turned suffering into purpose, who'd stayed kind in a world that rewarded cruelty. And he looked around at these people, this life, and felt something he'd spent years being afraid to feel: gratitude. Not the toxic positivity kind that pretends everything happens for a reason, or that suffering is somehow valuable, but real gratitude for the specific combination of circumstances and choices, and pure dumb luck that had led here instead of 1,000 other places. Gratitude to his mother for not letting poverty destroy her capacity for love. Gratitude to Marcus for friendship that had survived both scarcity and success. Gratitude to every person who'd read his words and told him they mattered. Gratitude to himself, even, for refusing to disappear when disappearing would have been easier. But mixed with that gratitude was survivor's guilt that never fully faded. Why him? Why did he get this ending when so many others who worked just as hard, sacrificed just as much, deserved it just as much, were still trapped in the circumstances he'd escaped? There was no answer. No logic to it. Just chance and timing and the chaotic butterfly effect of small moments building on each other. He could have easily been one of the ones who didn't make it. In most timelines, he probably was. This reality where he succeeded felt like the statistical outlier, not the expected outcome. And acknowledging that, really accepting it, meant accepting that the system was fundamentally unjust, that merit and effort had less to do with outcomes than people wanted to believe, that he hadn't earned this life so much as stumbled into it, while millions of people equally deserving stumbled in other directions. That knowledge, that awareness, became the driving force behind everything he did in his 40s and beyond. He couldn't fix the system alone, couldn't save everyone, couldn't undo the structural violence that continued to grind people up. But he could refuse to pretend it was okay, could use every platform to amplify voices still trapped in that violence, could fund organizations doing real work, could tell the truth even when the truth was uncomfortable, could be honest about his own journey without turning it into a motivational narrative that blamed victims for circumstances beyond their control, could insist loudly and repeatedly that the fact that one person made it out didn't mean the trap was acceptable, didn't mean the system was fine, didn't mean everyone else had failed for staying trapped. He wrote another book. This one wasn't about his story, but about the stories of dozens of people he'd met. The ones who hadn't escaped, who were still fighting, who deserved to be remembered even if they never became success stories. He wrote about dignity in the face of degradation, about community in the midst of scarcity, about the small acts of resistance and care that happened daily in places the powerful never looked, about mothers like his who worked themselves to death for children they'd never see prosper, about workers like Marcus who showed up day after day to jobs that ground them down, about kids in classrooms like the ones he'd taught in who had brilliance and potential that would never be realized because the world couldn't be bothered to invest in them. He wrote it as a memorial and a testimony and an indictment. The book didn't sell as well as the first one. Stories without heroes rarely do. But the people who needed to read it found it. And that was enough. The years accumulated. His hair started graying. His body started showing the wear of a youth spent in poverty and stress. He developed health issues that doctors traced back to childhood malnutrition and toxic stress. Another reminder that poverty writes itself into your cells, that you carry it forever even after you've escaped it, that there's no such thing as a clean break from circumstances that shaped your development. He managed it, had access to health care that would have been fantasy to his younger self, but it reminded him constantly that he'd never fully leave behind where he came from, that his body was a living record of those years, that survival had come with costs he was still paying. Marcus had a heart attack at 48. Survived it, thankfully, but it was a brutal reminder of what those years in the warehouse, that chronic stress, that grinding poverty did to bodies that were never meant to carry that much weight. They sat in the hospital room after, neither of them saying much, both of them thinking about how many people they'd known who hadn't survived their 40s, whose bodies had given out under the accumulated trauma of living poor in a rich country. "We made it," Marcus said finally, but it didn't sound like celebration. It sounded like acknowledgement of a debt they could never fully repay to the ones who didn't. The foundation kept growing, kept adapting to address needs as they emerged. During economic downturns, they focused on emergency aid. During stability, they focused on longer-term support and systemic advocacy. They never had enough resources to meet all the need. How could they? The need was infinite. But they did what they could, kept showing up, kept treating people with dignity, kept refusing to means test or judge or make people prove they were deserving enough for help. They just helped. Because everyone deserved help. Because struggling didn't mean you'd done something wrong. Because the whole point was to create a small pocket of the world that worked differently than the cruel indifference that dominated everywhere else. He watched his mother age into her 60s, then 70s. Watched her enjoy things she'd never had time or energy or resources for when she was younger. Watched her spoil grandkids from Marcus's daughter with the kind of attention and delight she'd wanted to give him but couldn't, because survival took precedence. She never expressed regret about those years of sacrifice, would probably deny them if he brought them up. But he saw it sometimes in her eyes when she watched those grandkids, a flicker of grief for the time she'd lost, the childhood she couldn't fully be present for because she was too busy trying to keep them both alive. He wished he could give her those years back, wished he could undo the damage poverty had done to her body and spirit. But time only moves forward. All he could do was make sure the rest of her life was easier than the beginning had been. The students kept coming. Generation after generation of young people trying to build futures in a world that seemed increasingly determined to foreclose possibility. The wealth gap widened. The cost of education and housing and health care spiraled beyond reason. The jobs that had once provided working-class stability disappeared or transformed into gig economy exploitation. And yet the kids kept showing up, kept trying, kept believing that maybe they could be the exception. He tried to balance hope with honesty, tried to tell them that yes, it was harder than it should be. Yes, the system was rigged. Yes, they would face obstacles that had nothing to do with their merit. But also, they had power. Not the power to individually overcome structural injustice, but the power to build community, to support each other, to fight for change, to refuse to accept suffering as natural. That was the only honest thing he could offer. Not false promises, but true solidarity. His work became less about individual storytelling and more about structural analysis. He collaborated with economists and sociologists and policy experts to document not just the human cost of poverty, but the mechanisms that created and perpetuated it. They published reports that got cited in legislative debates, wrote op-eds that shaped public discourse, built coalitions that pushed for actual policy change, living wages, universal health care, affordable housing, debt forgiveness, investments in communities that had been systematically divested from for generations. Progress was slow, glacially slow. The forces protecting inequality were powerful and entrenched. But small victories accumulated. A city passed a rent control measure. A state expanded Medicaid. A company agreed to pay its workers fairly after a successful organizing campaign. None of it was enough. All of it mattered. He spoke less frequently now, but with more precision. Turned down the big money speaking gigs at corporate conferences where executives wanted to feel good about inequality without actually addressing it. focused instead on community organizations, union halls, places where people were doing the actual work of building alternatives. He'd become something of an elder figure in certain circles. Not old exactly, but experienced enough to have perspective, to have watched strategies succeed and fail, to understand that change was both slower and more possible than people realized. Young organizers sought his advice. He tried to offer wisdom without pretending to have all the answers, tried to share what he'd learned while remaining humble about what he didn't know. The thing that surprised him most about aging was how the early traumas stayed vivid while later successes faded. He could still feel the gut punch of every rejection letter, the humiliation of poverty, the exhaustion of the warehouse, the fear in his mother's eyes. But his book's bestseller success? Already hazy. The awards and accolades? Increasingly abstract. The early pain had shaped him in ways that later triumph couldn't undo. He'd made peace with that, mostly. Understood that you don't heal by achieving success, but by learning to carry your scars without letting them define you. The wounds informed his work without overwhelming it. The memory of suffering kept him connected to people still suffering. The knowledge of what desperation felt like made him incapable of judging people for choices they made to survive. Marcus retired from the regular job, started working full-time on the podcast and the foundation. They'd built something that mattered, something that would outlast them. They'd trained a new generation of people committed to the work, created systems that didn't depend on any one person. That felt like the real legacy. Not individual success, but collective capacity. Not escaping and pulling the ladder up, but building more ladders, sturdier ladders, ladders that reached all the way down to where they'd been. They talked sometimes about the randomness of it all. How a different teacher, a different rejection, a different conversation could have led to completely different outcomes. How they'd both come so close to being statistics instead of survivors. How luck masqueraded as merit in a world desperate to believe that outcomes reflected something essential about character rather than the chaos of circumstance. The documentary about his life had been updated multiple times, following him across decades, showing not just the escape, but the long aftermath of escape. The complexity of carrying working-class roots into middle-class comfort. The tension between personal stability and collective struggle. The way success created new responsibilities and new kinds of guilt. The final version, released when he was in his 50s, ended not with triumph, but with continuation, showing him still working, still fighting, still connected to communities he could have left behind, still insisting that his story wasn't inspiration, but indictment. Critics called it depressing. He called it honest. The people who mattered understood. He'd never fully escaped imposter syndrome. Still walked into rooms full of educated, successful people, and felt like someone had made a clerical error, like eventually someone would notice he didn't belong and escort him out. Still heard echoes of every voice that had counted him out, told him to lower his expectations, looked at him and seen limitations. Therapy helped, community helped, time helped, but the ghosts of those early messages never fully disappeared. Maybe that was okay. Maybe staying slightly uncomfortable in spaces of privilege kept him connected to the reality most people lived. Maybe a little bit of imposter syndrome was healthy when you came from where he came from and ended up where he ended up. It was the people who felt entirely entitled to their success, who believed they'd earned every bit of it through merit alone, who worried him. Those were the people who could look at inequality and see natural order rather than systemic injustice. His mother died when he was 53. Peacefully in the house he'd bought her, surrounded by people who loved her. She'd lived to see him build a life, to see his work matter, to know that her sacrifice hadn't been for nothing. But God, it hurt. Hurt in ways he wasn't prepared for despite seeing it coming, despite having time to say everything that needed saying. Because she was the through line of his entire story, the reason he'd fought to survive when surviving felt impossible, the evidence that love could exist even in the midst of deprivation. Her funeral was massive. Hundreds of people whose lives she'd touched, mothers from the foundation she'd supported, students he'd taught who'd met her and been changed by her warmth, community members who remembered her from the old neighborhood. The pastor called her a saint. He wanted to object, to say she was just a person, just someone who did what she had to do. But maybe that was what sainthood actually looked like. Not grand gestures, but daily persistence. Not miracles, but the miracle of not giving up. He took time after she died, stepped back from public work to grieve privately, to process what it meant to exist in a world without her in it. Marcus and the foundation team held things down. Students were understanding. The world kept turning without his constant input, which was both humbling and clarifying. He wasn't indispensable. The work was bigger than him. That was good. That was how it should be. He spent months just walking, thinking, writing things he didn't publish, processing not just his mother's death but his entire journey, trying to understand what it all meant, if it meant anything, whether the fighting and building and struggling had actually changed anything fundamental or just rearranged pieces on a board that was still fundamentally rigged. He came back with new clarity. The work wasn't about winning. Systems of inequality were too entrenched, too defended, too profitable for too many people to imagine they'd be dismantled in his lifetime. But that didn't make the work futile. Every person helped, mattered. Every truth told created possibility for change. Every community built offered alternative models. Every young person taught to think critically about power and justice became a potential agent of transformation. You didn't do the work because you were guaranteed victory. You did it because not doing it meant accepting injustice as permanent. You did it because the people suffering deserved someone to fight for them, even if that fight was asymmetric and endless. You did it because your mother sacrificed everything for you, and you honored that sacrifice by refusing to be comfortable while others suffered what you'd suffered. At 55, he published what he knew would be his final book. Not because he was dying or retiring, but because he'd said what he needed to say, and now it was time for other voices. The book was a synthesis of everything he'd learned across decades of work. Personal narrative woven with structural analysis, specific stories illustrating systemic patterns, a clear-eyed look at both the cruelty of inequality and the resilience of people facing it. He dedicated it to his mother and to everyone who'd fought and lost, who'd tried and failed, who'd survived without succeeding, whose stories wouldn't be told, but who mattered just as much as the ones who became visible. The book's final line was, "They tried to end him. Instead, he became the beginning of everything. But the everything isn't finished. It continues in you." And that was the truth he'd learned over all these years. That individual stories of escape were beautiful but incomplete. That the point wasn't for one person to make it out, but for the system to change so everyone had a chance. That his journey from warehouse worker to best-selling author to documentary subject to foundation leader was simultaneously inspiring and indicting, proof that individual transcendence was possible, but also proof that it shouldn't be necessary, that people shouldn't have to be exceptional to deserve basic dignity and opportunity. The real work was building the world where his story would be boring, where kids growing up poor wouldn't need heroic persistence to get education, where single mothers wouldn't have to destroy their bodies working 3 jobs, where health care and housing and food were rights rather than privileges, where everyone, regardless of birth circumstances, had the foundation to build meaningful lives. He knew he wouldn't live to see that world. Probably several generations wouldn't. But every inch of progress mattered. Every person reached mattered. Every system challenged mattered. And his contribution, in the grand scheme, was simply this. He'd refused to disappear. Had turned his voice into a megaphone for other voices. had used his platform to make visible what society wanted to keep hidden, had insisted, loudly and without apology, that the people society discarded were actually the people who understood it best, who could speak most truthfully about its failures, who deserved to be centered rather than marginalized in conversations about change. The podcast continued, now hosted by younger people he and Marcus had trained. The foundation continued, led by a new generation with fresh ideas and energy. His writing continued, though less frequently and with less urgency. He taught part-time, mentored when asked, showed up for protests and organizing campaigns, stayed connected to the work without needing to be at the center of it. He'd become what his mother had been, a steady presence, a source of wisdom and support, someone who'd been through it and could offer perspective without claiming to have all answers. Looking back from 60, from the vantage point of a life that had been impossible at every turn and yet somehow happened anyway, he felt something complex and layered, pride in what he'd built, grief for what had been lost, anger at systems that hadn't fundamentally changed, hope in the people still fighting, exhaustion from decades of battle, peace in knowing he'd done what he could with what he had. The feelings coexisted, contradicted each other, refused to resolve into simple narrative. Which was fine. Life wasn't simple narrative. It was messy and complicated, and rarely offered the closure that stories promised. People still reached out, still told him what his work had meant to them, still shared their own stories of struggle and survival. He read every message, even though he couldn't respond to all of them. Each one reminded him why it mattered. Why telling the truth about hardship without false promises or easy answers mattered. Why refusing to let his story be co-opted into bootstrap mythology mattered. Why insisting that systems, not individuals, needed to change mattered. The messages came from everywhere. From people still in the depths of poverty, from people who'd escaped it, from people who'd never experienced it, but had their eyes opened to its reality. They came from teenagers and retirees, and everyone in between. They came from the United States, and dozens of other countries, where inequality took different forms, but felt remarkably similar to people living it. He thought often about that old man from the grocery store, the one who'd asked what he was doing there, who'd told him he wasn't stuck, just waiting, who'd planted a seed that took years to sprout, but eventually grew into everything that followed. He'd tried to find him once, to thank him, but couldn't track him down. Didn't know if he was still alive. But that brief encounter, that moment of being seen by someone who didn't have to see him, had changed the trajectory of his entire life. It reminded him that you never know what impact you're having. That small moments can carry enormous weight. That showing up with intention and attention might be the most important thing any of us do. So when students asked him for advice, for the secret to success, for the formula that would guarantee they'd make it, he told them the truth. There was no secret, no formula, no guarantee. Some people did everything right and still lost. Some people got lucky at the right moment and won. The randomness was real, and acknowledging it was important. But what you could control was showing up, being honest, supporting others, refusing to accept injustice as natural, building community, telling your truth even when your voice shook, fighting not because you knew you'd win, but because not fighting meant accepting defeat as permanent. That wasn't inspiring in the traditional sense. It didn't promise transformation or triumph. But it was true, and truth in the end was all he had to offer. They tried to end him before he'd barely begun. Every system, every institution, every voice of authority told him in subtle and explicit ways that he didn't matter, wouldn't succeed, should accept his station and stop reaching for more. They measured his worth by his zip code and his bank account, and found him wanting. They built barriers specifically designed to keep people like him in their place. They called it meritocracy while rigging every game. They called it opportunity while closing every door. They tried to erase him before he had a chance to write himself into existence. But here's what they didn't count on. They didn't count on a mother who believed when belief made no logical sense. They didn't count on an old man who saw him when he felt invisible. They didn't count on his own stubborn refusal to accept their verdict as final. They didn't count on the power of honest words to connect disparate struggles. They didn't count on community and solidarity, and people lifting each other up in the face of systems pushing them down. They didn't count on the possibility that being crushed might create diamonds rather than dust. They didn't count on him. And so what they meant to be an ending became a beginning. Not just for him, but for everyone who read his words and recognized themselves. Everyone who felt less alone in their struggle. Everyone who learned that poverty wasn't personal failure, but systematic violence. Everyone who found the courage to fight back, to speak up, to refuse to disappear. He became the beginning not because he was special or chosen or destined, but because he refused to let their story about him be the only story. Because he wrote a different narrative with his life. Because he transformed suffering into solidarity, pain into purpose, near death into persistent life. The beginning he represented wasn't triumph, it was continuation. It was the refusal to let injustice have the final word. It was the insistence that people mattered regardless of productivity or profitability. It was the belief that another world was possible even when this one seemed immovable. It was the daily practice of showing up and trying and failing and trying again, and building something that might, just might, make it slightly easier for the next person facing what he'd faced. And that beginning continues. In the foundation supporting families on the edge. In the students learning to think critically about power. In the workers organizing for dignity. In the voices speaking truths that comfort wants to silence. In every person who refuses to accept that suffering is inevitable, that inequality is natural, that the cruelty of the current system is the only possibility. In every small act of resistance and care and solidarity. In every truth told despite consequences. In every community built despite scarcity. The beginning isn't finished. It ripples outward. It compounds. It becomes something larger than any one person's story. So now let me ask you something that matters. What have they told you that you can't do? What dream have you buried because someone who didn't know your strength convinced you to know your place? What story about yourself have you accepted that was written by people who never bothered to see you? I want to hear it. Tell me in the comments below. And tell me where in the world you're watching from, because I promise you, wherever you are, whatever you're facing, you're not alone in this. Your struggle is connected to others' struggles. Your story matters even if no one's told you that before. And if this story reached something in you, if it reminded you that silence always comes before glory, if it made you feel less alone or more angry or more determined, or just more seen, then do something for me. Subscribe. Leave a like. Not because it helps me, though it does, but because every time you engage with stories that tell the truth instead of comfortable lies, you're participating in a beginning. You're saying that these voices matter, that these experiences deserve space, that the world as it is isn't the world as it must be. You're becoming part of the ripple that started when one person refused to let them end his story. And who knows? Maybe you're someone else's beginning. Maybe your refusal to disappear will be the thing that keeps someone else fighting. Maybe your truth will reach someone who desperately needs to hear it. Silence always comes before glory. But glory only comes if we refuse to stay silent. So speak, fight, build, begin.